Welcome to the Enneagram 2.0 podcast. I'm Beatrice Chestnut.
And I'm Uranio Pais.
And today we are talking about trauma and the Enneagram, or trauma healing and the Enneagram.
Right. And we are speaking from China this time, from Shanghai, where we are teaching several retreats. And we are using the facilities of our partners here. So thank you for Gao Dao, Teacher Gao, and his team.
Yes, it's always a big honor to be here in China and work with the students at the Enneagram school that we have partnered with here in China. And, here in China, like everywhere else in the world, there's a lot of trauma. I think we see particular kinds a little more than other places, particularly coming from the history of China, the recent history in terms of limitations on how many children people were allowed to have, and also a slightly different kind of patriarchal worldview in which there's a lot of filial piety, a lot of, you obey your parents, you don't say much, and also a kind of favoring of male children over female children. We see those kinds of things, particular trauma stories, traumatic experiences related to those kinds of things that maybe are a little bit more specific to here. But I would say generally, one of the things we really include in the Enneagram work we do as part of our partnership and our Enneagram school, CP Enneagram Academy, is trauma healing, because over time, and I think you've really taught me a lot about this, we have come to see how trauma in some ways gets stuck in, part of the sort of definition of trauma is an overwhelming experience, sometimes in childhood, sometimes after childhood, that gets lodged in the body, sometimes in ways people don't remember cognitively, sometimes because it happened very early. There's sort of chronic trauma that happened over a long period of time, or specific short-term experiences of trauma, different kinds of trauma. But it really is a big factor in what we need to do when we do psychological work in general. And when we're using the Enneagram to do our psychological growth work, it's very important to understand how trauma intersects with that work.
Yes. Well, particular retreats that we do deal a lot of with trauma. Trauma healing is a big thing for us in our school, and we've been getting great results, to be honest. And just want to say that while these are some of the traumas that are more common in China, there are similar things and not better or worse in all other places. So it's something that is ubiquitous, like it exists everywhere.
Ubiquitous,
really.
yes, yeah. Trauma generally, and physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, psychological abuse. These things happen everywhere. You find this kind of trauma everywhere. But of course, in certain cultures, you may find certain kinds of trauma that are specific to that culture because of certain factors within the culture. So I think it's been an amazing education for me to be doing this work, both when I was a psychotherapist and also, when working with you, and some of the retreats we do where we focus a little bit more on hearing people's story or pivotal important moments in childhood that really shaped them. When we hear those stories, they help us understand how might a person's traumatic experience in life, and often in childhood, how might that be impacting, first of all, their growth path? How might it be blocking them, the fact that they may have trauma they haven't yet healed? And how does it interact with the way we see someone's type and subtype and dominant instinct and repressed instinct show up? And what we find, and I think this podcast we really want to focus on some of the more practical cases and experiences we've had healing trauma, and what they've taught us about how trauma shows up, and how we do that work in light of the Enneagram. I think we did one other podcast on trauma a while ago, that was maybe taking a look at some of the general ideas that we had. And I think the intention of this one is to go a little bit deeper and give some examples that will hopefully help people start to get a better picture of how can we think about um, the way trauma colors the picture of somebody's self understanding and what they understand they need to do to grow, to remove blocks to their growth, to really take the self development journey that's guided by the Enneagram.
Right. Yeah. So, one question that we usually hear is, how can I know if it's personality or if it's trauma? And I want
Right.
to speak to that a little and then
I think that's an
really hear from you.
excellent question to start with.
Um, when you get to have a lot of experience with working, not only teaching, but working with people of each of the nine types, you know what the real pattern is. For instance, you know what is fear for a six,
Right.
right? And then if you are dealing with a six that has something extra in terms of that fear, you suspect, right?
Right.
Or what about someone that looks like a six but actually is of another type, and what you think looks like a six is trauma,
Right.
right? And that can work for all nine types. So it takes truly knowing the pattern in the average way, so that we can differentiate what is trauma and what is personality. Um, uh, but then if you see, for instance, an eight with fear, and that has always been like there, it might very well be a sign of trauma. And then there are other signs that are not type related, like the person doesn't remember the first years of life,
Right.
right?
Right.
What would you say?
That's a big sign of trauma, not remembering whole chunks of experience, especially in childhood. Well, I would say two things. One thing I would say is if you see someone who has, the usual type characteristics, but maybe one or two of those characteristics are really exaggerated, right? Like maybe a seven who really thrives on excitement and thrills, right? And maybe a little bit even addicted to excitement. And then feels like a big drop after, real letdown after the exciting experience is over, and almost starts to suffer because um, they they have a hard time when things aren't super exciting, and there's a little bit kind of an adrenaline junkie feel. Now, some sevens, many sevens have that to some degree, but when you see that really more so, or a stronger need to distract oneself as a seven, or maybe you have an eight that really denies certain things, like is even more using the defense mechanism of denial, like really doesn't see something in their life that other people see or that they have signs of, but they really have blocked it out. Sometimes these exaggerations of certain Enneagram personality traits can be a sign of trauma. And I would say in general, trauma is an overwhelming experience that the psyche almost can't cope with because it's so strong, it's so extreme. It either causes pain or the threat of pain, and so the body has to defend itself. The psyche kind of defends itself, and sometimes loses consciousness or blocks it out, but the body remembers. Like Bessel van der
Yeah.
Kolk, the very prominent trauma expert, has a book called "The Body Keeps the Score." Right? These traumatic experiences are always held in the body. So one of the things, of course, when we do trauma healing is you need to work with the body. You need to go to the body and kind of unlock sometimes a frozen response or some sort of stuckness in the body. But when we have a trauma, we need to defend against the overwhelming fear, threat, pain, whatever it might be, in order to survive that trauma, right? And our personalities, what are they? They're a defensive coping strategy in life. So it's a defensive structure. Our personality grows up to protect us from pain, different kinds of pain, regular pain, but also traumatic injury. So if we've been through a lot of trauma, often our personality has come in and sort of built a defense, sometimes so that we don't remember, or sometimes that we don't remember all of it. But we tend to then, of course, have problems that flow from that defense, right? So just like when we're doing personality Enneagram work of any kind, um, by adulthood, we need our personality defenses in childhood. We need them to survive childhood and teenage years. But by the time we reach adulthood, the personality itself and its defenses, its defensive patterns, have become very entrenched and unconscious, and they become the problem themselves. So, similarly, when we go through a traumatic experience, the personality helps us survive it by coming in and, sometimes dissociating, employing different kinds of defenses in order to help us survive the traumatic experience. But then afterwards, that becomes a something that lives within us that is blocking our growth, because it's something that hasn't been healed. It's like a wound deep down that has not been attended to and healed. And the defenses that grow up around that can tend to be more rigid and hard to change because they're protecting you from something really extreme. And of course, people then start to judge themselves because they can't change, or their defenses are really strong, or they have some personality trait that they, can't seem to shift. And of course, the judging and the self criticism that we all do make things worse. And so, what we try to do is create an atmosphere of safety and support, so that people can feel more supported, more encouraged, and more compassionate with themselves, so that they can open up to having that trauma healed, to accessing it sometimes, very often through the body. But, the Enneagram, our understanding of the Enneagram type patterns can help us a lot in this. So I think there's a really, really important integration that we can do, say for psychotherapists and other kinds of people who work with the Enneagram, doing other kinds of things, and trauma specialists who might get interested in the Enneagram, about how can we use these both together in a way that can help our trauma healing be more effective, sort of more targeted, and really help people in better ways more often, because we understand the way personality type as a defense, both protects us from experiencing our traumas in a way that would be damaging, but also then become something that keeps us stuck or holds us back from all the growth we might do, until we pay attention to that trauma. And one last thing I want to say, and then I want to hear from you any thoughts that you have, um, is that, while trauma might hold us back in our growth work in particular ways, one of the things we need to be alert to, and again with a lot of compassion for ourselves, is when we feel a particularly acute challenge or stuck place, or block in our growth, when we can see that potentially as a sign of trauma, it can help us get to the core of what we need to do to grow more fast. And once we heal that trauma, when we can really do have a good experience of healing, addressing and healing a trauma, that can really provide a springboard to a lot of growth that can flow out of that, sometimes from releasing all the energy that we unconsciously put into defending ourselves from being aware of that trauma. And sometimes just because it's like once you remove a block, your energy can flow more easily, and new insights can come, and new experiences open up, once that pain point, that extreme pain point, has been understood, made more conscious, and healed.
Right. Yeah, I think there are two basically two different approaches to trauma
Oh,
healing.
wait, before you say that, I want to say one more thing. I
Mhm.
started off saying that one of the ways we can see a sign of trauma when we're working with someone or when we're working with an Enneagram type is a trait that's more exaggerated, right? Like everything fits into the type pattern, but maybe there's one or two of the traits that, ooh, that person has that really more than other people of that same type.
Mhm.
Like a seven who's more, excited, attracted to excitement, or maybe more fast moving. Some, sevens tend to have a fast pace, but a seven that really talks fast or
Mhm.
really moves fast or distracts themselves a lot,
More than average.
more than average, right? That can be one sign, again, in all types. But another thing is when there's something different, right? Now, sometimes what we see is someone thinks they're a type, but then they start really seeing these traits that don't really fit with that type. And so they start thinking, well, maybe I'm this other type. Like I thought I was a two, but now I'm starting to see things that make me think I might be an eight, actually. Because maybe I had a trauma in childhood that said you can't be angry, you can't be strong, you have to be really nice to everyone all the time, you have to be pleasing. And so that person even thinks they're another type. But then there are a lot of examples we could give of this. But if you see someone that's really confused about their type because they have traits that don't fit, they have many of the traits of that the type they think they are, but there are certain traits that don't fit the picture and don't make sense. Sometimes those other traits, a little bit like your type 6 example, can be coming actually from trauma. So you have someone who has a type, who has some of those type patterns, but then they have this other
Mm.
focus or this other experience. And sometimes this emerges over time, actually. And you could think, well, have I switched type, or is this a sign of growth? And sometimes it is a sign of growth, right? Like you're doing good inner work. And so you're able to get more in touch with your trauma. And sometimes we say that, our bodies, our psyches are wise, and these traumas only come up to be healed when we're ready. And so sometimes when we see someone doing good inner work, and all of a sudden they're like, you know, like we worked with an eight who was all of a sudden saying her main issue was abandonment and loss, and thinking people didn't like her. Those don't tend to be things that eights focus on, but this is what this person was saying, and we thought, wow, maybe we should check out four. Maybe this person is actually a four. And of
Mhm.
course, sexual fours look a lot like eights, especially sexual eights. And so when we really worked with her and asked her a lot of questions about her type and staying open to what was really true, we realized actually she was an eight, she was a sexual eight, but she had a trauma, a big trauma that hadn't been healed.
Right. So basically, when there is something off, considering the person's personality, uh, we should suspect of trauma.
Right.
And it's not only about type; it's also about
Right.
other things in personality,
Right.
like instincts.
Right.
Just these days, we had a self-preservation dominant person. It doesn't matter the type now. That said, I'm pretty sure I'm self-pres, and I don't mind death. I think it's
Uh,
great. I think it's all
it's a gift, she
okay.
said. Oh,
A
I think
gift.
of,
Yeah.
because when we teach about the self-preservation instinct, we often teach that what's at the core of it is fear of death, right? A lot of different things can feel like your life is threatened, even when it's really not, when you're self-preservation dominant. And this person thought she was a self-preservation eight. And but then she was saying, oh no, I believe death is a gift. That's my philosophy. I look forward to death. Death is fine. And so we thought, wow, is she either not really self-preservation aid? Is she maybe a different kind of aid? What's going on that what she's saying doesn't fit with what you would typically hear from someone who's self-preservation dominant?
And ended up it was trauma.
Yeah.
So just as an example, and so I think there are two groups of approaches to trauma healing. One is, oh, okay, I understand this is where it's coming from, but I'll deal more with the symptoms, or I don't even need to know
Right.
what is the cause. I'll deal with the symptoms, and then I'll need to forever pay attention to trigger warnings. So this is one thing, and I respect that. But the other thing is
The other
really
approach.
the other kind of group of approaches
Right.
is really getting into the root cause, the trauma itself, and go inside it, which can be done only if there is true competence for avoiding re-traumatization,
Right. Someone who's
right?
really trained to work with trauma
Yeah.
because it's a very delicate matter.
But then when there is this person,
Yeah.
it's it's really more effective, and the results are amazing. And the Enneagram, in my view, calls a little bit more for this kind of deep healing, if there is the competency available. And I see that the Enneagram works in a brilliant way when this kind of process is done,
Mhm.
because as soon as the trauma is truly being released, what happens with the person? What happens are manifestations of the higher self. And there are 9 different manifestations when trauma gets healed. Like, as a quick example, for an 8 that has just healed trauma, you can sense all the softness, the sweetness of innocence.
Mm.
But for a 6 that has just healed trauma, you can sense all power in the world of
Courage and
strength,
strength.
courage.
Yeah.
So they, when they get out of trauma positions, they go to their best. And the Enneagram informs us what is each of the 9 types best. And then you can know when that is approaching, and therefore trauma is getting healed. So it's just an example of how the Enneagram can inform trauma healing work. Now, I think it would be nice if we talked about a few cases, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
briefly per
Yeah.
type.
Yeah. And of course, with all possible anonymity, just not mentioning
Mm,
any identifying characteristics, but
mm.
just
Yeah.
some examples from our
Maybe
experience.
you could start with 8, given that we had an example a few
Yeah.
hours ago.
Yeah.
If you can just make it short, and then we go through all 9 types.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we worked with this lovely woman. You could tell she was kind of defended. She felt a little bit intimidating, so we thought she could be an 8, but also what she was saying spoke a lot to all the 4 themes, right? So we had a question, is she a 4 or an 8? So we started with that, exploring that type. And she also was, although she was sort of defended and intimidating, she was also expressing a big desire for healing. She was really wanting to come to the retreat that we're offering, and so we also had signs that she was really ready. And she's been doing some good inner work. So when we worked with her, what we found was she was a sexual 8, and she had been her parents basically had left her with her grandparents in childhood from age 0 to 5, and then they came back and got her at 5. And so she had really bonded with her grandfather. And remember, sexual dominance of all types really need to bond, archetypally with the opposite sex parent, but that's just archetypally, right? It can be a same sex parent. It's more the masculine figure if it's a girl, the feminine figure if it's a boy. But again, there's a lot of more gender fluidity happening these days. And so just hear what we're saying as a general archetype, not as something that's really concrete. But in her case, she had bonded with a grandfather and saw her grandfather as real. She loved her grandfather, and she hated her parents. And as we explored, what we got a sense of was that and she was also very angry, but has recently been getting in touch with sadness, very recently, and really getting in touch with sadness, but still very angry and, very, quick to anger at work, wanting people to do things her way, has problems in her marriage with her husband, and a few more things. But basically, what we came to see was that she had a big trauma that she wasn't aware of, and that was being separated from her father. And she would say things like, I hate my parents, I hate them. But underneath that anger and hate was a huge wound, a big trauma about being left by her parents, and especially her father, at a very early age, and then them coming back and taking her away from her grandfather, who she had come to love and who treated her quite well. And so we helped her to go underneath the anger and into that sadness and hurt and pain, and almost a sense of brokenheartedness. And again, for an 8, of course, that's very challenging work, because going into that vulnerability, and this was in a group in a retreat, but she did a great job. She really, really went there and felt, and you could see her whole body melt, and her really, really get in touch with the sadness of this. And then we, bringing her through to the other side. Uranio brilliantly being the father she didn't have, and really hugging her, and sort of on the other side also helping her get in touch with that deep longing for that father figure, and for the hug of the father, and again archetypally, and in her case the father, and at the end of it, super soft, very much in her sadness, very vulnerable, but in a way that really was the mark of true strength and courage, because it takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage to heal our traumas.
Mm. So I'll give an example of a 9.
Okay.
Okay, I remember a person, a student, who um, reported some discomfort in the body, but at times, because 9s numb discomfort out. But then at a retreat, this person was willing to go to that and see what was in there. And then, as a body type, we do a very body based approach with body types in general. And he got in touch with very early sexual abuse, right? And that was a moment when, there was that resistance of sloth for 9s, of really connecting to that and going deep into that, and then not connecting but just seeing that, and then seeing other people's perspectives, for instance. So we help him get really in touch with that wound and cry it out. So 9s in sloth anesthetize the heart, and there needs to be a coming back to the heart for that, right? So open the heart big time, and then cried it out, and then there was a relief that was very different from sloth, right? Which sometimes 9s mistake. Sloth and relaxation, they are completely different things, but they might not know the difference. And then there was a very beautiful scene. But knowing he's a 9, um, we knew that sometime later he would have forgotten that, the healing.
Yes.
And it would again come to the unconscious and say, oh, okay, so there was a first layer of healing, and 9s run the risk of forgetting all of that, and not going for the second and third. So there is an extra need to remind the 9 of what was going on there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes what we see with 9s too is, if they've been, say, um, physically abused, they need to go into the pain of that, the vulnerability, but then sometimes they need to get in touch with anger, right? And that anger is also very important and helps connect them with their power. And so sometimes we see 9s after the trauma healing, being not only more in touch with their hearts, but also in touch with their body in a new way, and in touch with their power and strength in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So for one, I'll mention one thing. Maybe
Please.
you can complement. You know so much about ones too. So I remember a type 1 person, a social 1 person, that had trauma around bullying. By the way, depending on the dominant instinct, some traumas are more common.
Right.
They have been more impactful for people, depending on the instinct. So bullying is something we always see for social dominance.
Right.
And then the social 1 had suffered bullying at school, but really bad bullying, and for a prolonged time. And then this person, uh, um, sh- of course, became even more rigid in being right. But the problem is, the bullies were going after this person because um, they have very good grades. They were better and better. So the better he became, the worse the
The
bully
more
became.
they attract bullies, which are sometimes operating from their own
Exactly,
insecurity and envy of someone who's
exactly.
competent and smart.
And then eventually he had an episode, but a few years later, of having a very bad reaction and physically abusing one of the bullies, and the bully stopped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the memory of this person, that thing was on top of all the bullying suffered. Like, I
Ah,
did something wrong in
uh-huh.
response to the bullying, right? The
Right.
inner critic and self-praise was
Right.
second in the
And
sequence
sort of
here.
allowing their anger to be expressed can
Yeah.
feel like something they should never do because it's bad.
Yeah, and while we all need to be mindful of anger in
Of
society,
course.
that was a more evolved part of him than the one that was trying to be even more more righteous and more
Mm,
behaved before.
right. Right. Right.
So we needed to work through all those understandings of what was right or
Mm,
wrong and
mm-hmm.
what he needed. And
Mm,
one way was of getting out of that bullying after processing the actual pain was to allow this person to be a little less right, a little more like a bad guy kind of person, without
mm-hmm.
beating anybody or anything, of
Right.
course.
Right. Channeling anger in a healthy way
Yeah, but
instead of reacting
yeah,
from it, which they don't allow themselves to do
right,
very often. And if they do, then it becomes a,
without the inner critic,
yeah,
then, right?
yeah, then it becomes something they beat themselves up for forever. Yeah.
And now for choose, I've seen many cases of neglect that the
Mm.
two cannot name as such,
Yes, yes.
because of pride, and that has to do with going to the arrow to four. I'm not saying that the biggest kind of abuse for choose is neglect. I'm just
Right.
mentioning this as an
As an
example.
example of what we see. Yeah.
But then, when neglect happens with the two, there is this thing of saying that it was okay, it wasn't too bad, and I can't complain, or I made it happen
Is
anyway.
because
And
I deserved it. Yeah,
yeah,
because there's this, often it has to do with like not getting any needs met or not getting certain needs met, that
mm,
are very important needs. And often what the two does is kind of go into overdrive around pleasing others and being nice to others. And because, the two psyche kind of has this logic of like, well, if I don't get my needs met, there must be something wrong. I need to treat other people better, so maybe they'll meet my needs in some way. And we choose also repress emotions. We worked with someone recently who got in touch through an exercise we did at a retreat with huge sadness and pain around complete neglect and lack from
yeah,
childhood, like not getting any needs met, and especially not being seen and affirmed, which is something twos really need, mirroring, which is the parent really seeing the child and affirming them, giving them positive messages about who they are. We all need that. All of us need that, but heart types need that especially. And a lot of their defenses come from not getting that, sort of twos, threes, and fours in different ways. But when a two doesn't get that need met, again, it kind of goes unconscious. It's like you don't remember not getting something. You just go into that mode of, I have to be better. I have to look better. I have to please people in order to, again, the unconscious logic of coping is like, then maybe I'll get something of what I need. And sometimes when twos work on that trauma, what happens is a huge upwelling of emotion.
yeah,
And in the case of this person the other day, we actually we were playing some music to help people get in touch with their emotions, and we played a sad song, and she really started the long
crying.
repressed sadness started really coming out. And then we played a happy song, to see if people can get in touch with these, to measure how well can I get in touch with these emotions. And she really cried all through the happy song as well, and for some time thereafter. And what we told her is we tried to really reassure her, like, you've been repressing this deep, deep, deep pain for this huge lack, because she told us about the lack that she felt in childhood, for a long time. So you're going to, and which twos do. So you're going to need to create space to really allow yourself to cry and be sad and talk about it with people. And of course, part of the way the pride comes in is, telling the person as a coping strategy, like, if I'm just nice enough to other people, if I just do enough for other people, then finally I'll somehow get what I need. Or they can think, well, it's not okay, to cry or to be sad or to need help. And so, but the two really getting in touch with trauma needs to rely on others, which can be really good for them, and really take a lot of space to really have their feelings that they haven't allowed before out of
Mm,
as a trauma reaction.
mm. So for a three, I could say many things, but one that I remember right now is a man who had a narcissistic father. And in childhood, no matter what he did in his three strategy of earning love by doing and being good in something, no matter what he did, he wouldn't be approved by his father. His
Mm,
father would be around,
mm,
don't get me wrong, but it was all about the father.
all right.
And then he would remain feeling unmet by the father. And the relationship between boy and father is super important,
Mm,
according to Jung, and it's clear.
mhm.
So he felt completely unmet. And then there was
Not
another
seen.
not seen, and then there was another consequence of never having a good masculine role model, which is important for everybody, but essential for three. For three, not having role models is like, how can I learn?
How can I know who I am if I don't have someone to model from and understand how to be?
Yeah, and then the way we worked through that was really providing that role model and relieving the situation, as in it's happening right now, and let's do it relationally.
Right.
And this is one big advantage of teaching, you and me teaching together,
Right.
because it's man and woman. And then
Yes.
sometimes B plays the mother or I play the
Yes.
father, sometimes it's
It's
both.
both. Yeah.
Sometimes, like we had a student the other day that was projecting her bad father onto me, and
Yeah.
then B did the work and I was apart, and then
Luckily, she had a good mother projection.
yeah.
Yeah. And her good mother was a self pres too. So that came in handy, like me.
And it happens the other way around at
Yes,
times.
it does.
So yeah, so I think that for three, I really learned that there needs to be a rehearsal of a new situation in a relational way.
Mhm.
And then the trauma is being healed after the three has really cried out a lot, owning that they are a true emotional type, like heart type. But also when you start seeing that the three is not as concerned with getting approval and being seen. They are feeling better with themselves. Like that need to be met has been a bit more satiated. So that was a beautiful case that I remember, but there are so many.
Yeah, and what you're saying reminds me of, I think some, when you heal the trauma, it's like you need to go back into it. And what it really is about is reprogramming that, is having almost a different physical response, a different way. Like sometimes we bring in the adult self to save or to support the child self, and repair, right? Giving the person a physical feeling of something completely different. Like if they were completely alone in a situation, or they're neglected by their parents or not seen, being really seen by us,
Yeah,
taking that role of the good parent. And often we'll even say, now I'm playing the role of an ideal father, an
right.
ideal mother. And I'm not your actual mother, and this is what you should have had, and then providing that. And sometimes it's backup, like
Mhm.
really having them feel you, backing them up, or having them see you, or having them praise you in an important way. And for threes, threes really need that mirror. All of us need it, and all heart types need it, but threes really need it, because it's almost like they're looking out there in the world with the question from early on, saying, who am I supposed to be in order to get the love? And so, like you said, in not having a role model, we hear a lot of trauma actually from like people who, like, my parent never hugged me, my father never came to any of my sports games, or never praised me, or never recognized me. That's a trauma. There are many different kinds of trauma, but that can be an emotional trauma, not getting core needs met. And then it's almost like you're living in an emotional vacuum, like there's no emotional atmosphere in which to breathe. And so threes also need, I think, a lot of reassurance that they need, that it's good to listen to their heart. It's good to listen to their pain, their sadness, that there's wisdom there. And because they tend to look outside themselves or get involved in doing and performing to
Right.
prove themselves.
Right. Right. Yeah, and we always use the power of the group when
Yes.
healing trauma. It makes it way deeper and
Yes.
effective. We also use rituals at the end,
We use
including
music,
music,
dancing
dancing.
together.
That many authors talk about the
Yeah.
importance of this,
Yeah.
and we have our long term experience on how this helps. And then I want to go to the four, and I want to say a general thing that we've seen many times and ask you to comment. Self-press four that endures, the stoic four, having suffered physical abuse and not being able to be in touch with how bad that was.
Right. Right. Right.
What would you
Yeah,
say about
yeah.
this?
I mean, self-pres four, and again, I think when we talk about fours already, you almost have to talk about the trauma defense being different for different subtypes of four, and
Hmm.
certainly there are different subtypes for all 27, all different subtype reactions when it comes to defending against being conscious of trauma. And for self-pres four, it's a bit like um, they get these messages from early on, like, just don't cry, don't complain, just endure the pain or bear the burden. And so, and again, we have to remember that when we get these messages growing up, everyone sees it becomes your normal, even if it's very abnormal or it's very abusive. And so see self-pres four as a couple of things happen. They get almost addicted to enduring pain, and to the point where they don't really even fully feel it because they've been carrying so much with them for so long. Almost like they're not fully in touch with it because it's like carrying a giant load on your back. And since you've been doing it so long, you almost go numb to the fact that you're carrying this load on you. It doesn't occur to you to put it down. But not only that, with self-preservation fours, there's a kind of masochism at the heart of this type, where they get kind of attached to the suffering, and all fours get attached to the suffering at some point. It's almost like at an unconscious level, my suffering somehow makes me special or redeems me or will attract attention, and people will see me finally, or see me as special or unique, or see my unique quality to bear pain, or they interject other people's pain, and it's almost a service they're doing, like, oh, I'm carrying my father's pain because I could sense that he couldn't feel this much pain, but I can. So it's the self-pres for, gets trapped in the defense of enduring, and even to the point where it's hard to feel it. And if they start to feel it, when we help them get in touch with it, it's hard to let it go. It's almost like, well, I'm not really sure I want to put down this heavy load, partly because it's become so familiar, and it's a survival strategy, even one that people who aren't fours may not understand, and something that they get stuck in. And so you almost have to really support the self-pres for a lot in putting down the load, allowing for lightness, allowing for relief of suffering, after they get more in touch with the pain.
Right. Having an idea that another time we should do another episode talking about the most common ways that each type traumatizes other people, especially kids. I think
Yeah,
this can be
yeah.
very useful to know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so
Yeah.
too. And of course, if you're a parent out there, don't start getting overly worried about traumatizing your kids, because some of what we're talking about just happens in an unconscious world. Even with our best efforts, sometimes we don't just understand in the moment. We have our own traumas that we maybe haven't healed. So
Yeah.
if you're listening to this, please give yourself some compassion and
Yeah.
don't worry too much about inflicting trauma. Although I agree that that's a
Episode.
good
Yeah,
episode.
we just have so much experience, and maybe we can share some of that later.
Yeah.
But then fives. When fives suffer abuse, what happens is that they go even more radically inside themselves. It's like if it's physical abuse, they disconnect from the skin and they don't feel a thing,
Mm.
and they have this very big distance from the person, the abuser,
Mm-hmm.
that is not healthy
Mm-hmm.
because it's running away. It's the isolation thing,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't heal the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I remember someone who had been physically abused very badly by an older brother. And this person reported a sexual five in this case, reported that it was so hurtful, physically and emotionally, to be abused. And then, poof, all of a sudden, he started feeling any kind of pain during the beating.
Feeling any kind or no kind? No pain.
Feeling any pain. He
Not
stopped
feeling.
feeling any pain
Okay, yeah. Okay.
at a certain point.
Not feeling pain at
Not
certain
feeling
point.
pain. And before he was feeling a lot, but then
Mm.
whoop, it's
He
like
disconnected.
whoever's a five, no, it's like a key that turns and then you don't feel anything,
Mm.
right? So then it probably happened a lot more, but he hadn't registered,
Mm.
that whole second part of
Mm-hmm.
the history of abuse. And then the healing had to do with reconnecting to what was happening, to the abuse that he was just numbing out. And it wasn't exactly the dissociation thing. He knew that that was happening. He
Uh-huh.
wasn't dissociated. He was just isolated,
Yes,
and he
and
had
well, isolation being the separating out thoughts from feelings and
and
disconnecting
sensations
from the
from
feelings and
from
the sensations of the
from
body.
thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the thing is, he had to get back in touch with that very bad pain, both physical and emotional, and the adult in him came to help the kid in pushing the brother away symbolically, and we do that quite a bit in with techniques for that. And then he really felt empowered, and he had to own his own anger to give the brother something back, but instead he channeled all that power into good things for himself in his life, like manifesting more in his business.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And one of the things that you mentioned that triggered an idea for me that I wanted to mention generally about trauma is another sign of trauma, in addition to like when a person doesn't remember like whole years of their life, or we even heard from someone last week, they didn't remember anything before they were 20. Right. Some people will say, I didn't remember anything until middle school, or that's always a sign of trauma. Then also physical symptoms that aren't explained by anything physical. So you sometimes hear of people who have like some sort of pain in their body, chronic pain, and they've gone to a medical doctor and been checked out and they don't find anything. These kinds of things can sometimes also be a
Right.
sign of trauma.
Mm. As for six,
Yeah.
I think one case touched me so much many years ago. A self-pressed six woman who had lived throughout her life with her schizophrenic mother, no father, and father was simply not there. Another sister, but she carried all that pain all along, and she had to do everything all the time. And if she was at home, she would need to cope with all of that undiagnosed schizophrenic mother.
Mm.
And when she wasn't home, bad things would happen, and she would need to go back, and the neighbors and everything. And when she reported all the story, one thing got clear, and that I see as a pattern for all sixes. Sixes endure trauma situations more than any other type because of how strong they are in essence. It's like they can cope with so much pain, and it's almost like nothing breaks them down. You know, it's something amazing. The saying that life doesn't give us anything we can cope with.
Mm.
Then you see that sixes are stronger because some of the worst kinds of traumas I've seen happened with sixes. And as as a matter of fact, sixes are stronger, and the Enneagram explains that when it comes to the holy ideas and how when you really work with sixes, you see that. Although they think exactly the opposite, that they are weaker many times. So this woman coped and coped and coped and did really well in dealing with all of that until much later in life her mother was diagnosed, and then things started changing a little, and then she had to deal with all the trauma of all that situation, looking at herself and giving herself a chance. But also, she had to cope with the fact that she was very, very strong to endure all of that, and many people wouldn't have endured, would have been made much worse than she actually was. So, there was an aspect in her trauma healing which was, wow, you are amazing. And look at you. And then she says, really? And wow, yeah, and I'm pretty well right now. So I thought this was an amazing case to teach me about sixes.
Mhm.
Any comment?
Um, I'm just aware that we're sometimes talking about one subtype and not the other. And, I think sometimes with sixes, because they've got kind of, they sort of explain things mentally. Um, and they may be, projecting their authority out. Sometimes they don't really realize what they've been through. They don't, they can sort of intellectualize it and not really get in touch with the emotions. It's sort of like go to the mental as opposed to feeling the feelings of
Right.
it.
That's important to know
Yeah.
also. Maybe for all head types. Now, for sevens, one example is someone who had been in a very bad car accident. And it wasn't a childhood trauma, it was like our mid teens ages. And then two people had died, they were friends, and then two had survived, one being this woman. And the way that rationalization dealt with trauma, which is the defense mechanism for sevens, was very specific. Like, and it was a social seven, so talking about that other person who survived, and how important it was for that person to survive, and then things she did for the families of those two friends, and never getting in touch with her own pain. It would have been different if she was a self-pressed seven, but rationalization was finding its ways to um, kidnap the memories when the memories came back. So memories are pushed away in accidents many times by all of us when it's traumatic. Then we start recovering them. Then what happens? Our defense mechanisms try to deal with those memories so that we don't suffer.
Right. And one of the interesting things about sevens when we do trauma healing is the first thing the seven often says is, "Oh, I had a very happy childhood." Right. And then you start hearing them say, "Oh, but I don't remember these 6 years of my childhood." Or you start hearing them tell actual stories, and you find out, wow, this person went through a lot of trauma. And so it's really normal for sevens to, the seven mind to really not see the trauma or the pain that they went through. And so at certain points, though, I think sometimes sevens are ready to really face that. And sometimes it helps to follow the anxiety. Like sometimes if sevens have been through trauma, it's like the anxiety kind of pokes through the happy exterior, or maybe they underneath that they tell you that they're really self-critical, really harsh on themselves, and there are signs that they're really trying to keep something out of their awareness. And of course, sevens need to learn that if they go into the trauma, into the pain, they will come back out again, and things will be better. They will have a better experience. And so sometimes you need to help sevens understand mentally what the process is. And recently we did work with someone who was she said she felt challenged in life by really going for excitement and then feeling this huge letdown after the excitement was over. And it turns out she had huge trauma in childhood where she was left alone and experienced something extremely fearful. And so what she was kind of, like she was sort of mirroring, going for the excitement that was sort of an echo of the fear, but then feeling like it never kind of got resolved. She never, so by taking her back into that fear and helping her through it and get to the other side and feel well again, you can kind of help the person with the addiction to excitement that is actually a distraction or a way of not seeing the pain underneath. It needs
Right.
to be addressed.
And with sevens, it's not enough to bring them back and make them feel good again. It's also very important in the end to have them observe how they went through pain and the pain receded. Like
Yeah.
how it's a limiting belief that if they get in touch with that pain, it will never end.
Right.
So helping them see that also as a more general thing, beyond the particular trauma healing.
Right. Yeah, so really important topic. I think we'll keep exploring, maybe do webinar on this, or more more things on this, because I think it
Yeah.
is such an important topic. And one of the things I think has been something positive since the pandemic is that people have been pushed more into their trauma, and they're also more open. It's like you can talk about psychological issues and problems and traumas, anxieties more openly with less stigma, at least in the US, it seems that way. And I think that's a good thing, because most all of us have experienced some sort of trauma. And I really encourage people not to compare their experience to others, like, oh, well,
Mm.
this other person has been through a really bad trauma, really obvious trauma, physical abuse or sexual abuse, and my trauma isn't bad, then I shouldn't complain or I shouldn't have an issue. A lot of times, like for instance, not being seen in your family, not being understood, recognized, valued, uh, throughout your life, that can be a trauma. I think we need to recognize that some traumas may not be as obvious, but their trauma is all the same, and that it's not the story that we should compare. It's more of our inner experience of not getting what we needed, or feeling stuck or challenged in some way that's pointing to something that needs to be healed. And that is a trauma, because the trauma is defined by how the person experienced it. And especially when we're children, a lot of things can be traumatic, and it may not look so bad from the outside, but you need to watch out about minimizing what you may have been through, because we all need healing. And
Right.
certainly the Enneagram brings us to the path of healing and growth. And hopefully this can be something
Yes.
that help open,
Right.
create some new inspiration for people.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the webinars, we have so much material on this and everything else for members on our platform, CP Online. And we do so much work on this in our retreats. So check them out if you're interested.
Yeah, and I just want to end maybe by saying how much I appreciate and am inspired by people we work with
Yeah.
in their work in entering into and healing trauma, because I mean I'm constantly inspired,
Yeah. Me
honored,
too.
and motivated to keep doing this work, and to help, and to spread the work, and to encourage and support other Enneagram practitioners doing this work, and different kinds of Enneagram work, because I see the healing that happens and the change that creates. And I know that has an impact on the world and on
Mm.
humanity. And
Yeah.
I thank you for your efforts.
Mm,
And,
and
and,
you,
I, and I
B.
know you have special skills that you bring to this, but also you bring a huge dedication. And I think sometimes we even have to remind ourselves, we only do our, if we so much want to help people through their trauma. And
Yeah.
sometimes we need to be humble that we only can do so much, and it's
Right.
the person themselves that really makes the choice to take the risk, and to trust that they can work through it,
Right.
and be more whole.
Yeah, and times we work with collective trauma, so much to say
Yes,
here, but
yes,
hopefully
yes.
this was a useful episode for
Yeah,
you
yeah.
listening to us.
And maybe we'll do another podcast, a future podcast or webinar on collective trauma, because we do see that. And of course, when people heal their individual trauma, sometimes that, has an effect on the collective. And sometimes people really courageously help heal family or systemic trauma. And I know that there's more and more work being done in the world today on that, which is also
Right.
really important.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you for our good exchange.
Yeah. It's good to be here in China with you
Yes,
again.
excellent.
All right. Well, that does it for this episode. So we really thank you for listening, for watching, for tuning in. And we hope you join us again next time for the Enneagram 2.0 podcast, where we talk about all things Enneagram.